The most dangerous theft is not the one that empties your bank account, but the one that teaches the world to clap for the thief. The chandeliered ballroom of the Hudson Innovation Forum glittered above Manhattan like it had been designed specifically to make ordinary people feel underdressed. 200 founders, investors, attorneys, and journalists sat beneath its crystal light, their attention fixed on the stage where Ethan Bennett stood accepting the Founder of the Year award for Nexera Systems. He looked exactly the way success was supposed to look in a magazine profile. Dark tailored suit, silver watch, controlled smile, the kind of confidence that made people assume he had earned every inch of the room. Beside him stood Vanessa Cole, his fiancée and newly appointed head of communications, her hand resting lightly on his arm as cameras flashed from the front row. To the audience, they were a power couple, polished, modern, unstoppable. To Claire Bennett, sitting quietly at a back table near the service doors, they looked like a beautifully framed lie. She had not planned to come. The invitation had arrived through a small business mentorship program she sometimes advised, and for 3 days it sat unopened on her kitchen counter in Queens, beside a stack of client invoices and a chipped blue mug she had owned since before the divorce. Nexera's name printed in gold at the bottom of the card had felt like a hand closing around her throat. 5 years ago, before the venture capital, before the magazine covers, before Ethan learned to say "my vision" with practiced humility, the idea had another name. Lumaloop. Claire had written it at a pine kitchen table at 1:17 in the morning while Ethan slept upstairs, surrounded by cold coffee, retail data reports, and handwritten notes from store owners who could not afford expensive customer management software. It had been her answer to a problem no one powerful seemed interested in solving. Tonight, Ethan was being celebrated for solving it. Claire wore a simple navy dress and a cream blazer, not expensive enough to attract attention, not plain enough to invite pity. She had chosen both carefully. She was not there to perform grief, and she was certainly not there to create a scene, because women like Claire were always punished twice. First for being wronged, then for failing to look pleasant about it. She told herself she was only there to prove she could sit in the same room as the life he had stolen and still breathe. Then Ethan saw her. His eyes paused over the crowd, landed on her face, and for one thin second the smile slipped. Across New York, the kind of businesses that knew every customer by face but lost them anyway because they could not track loyalty, follow-up messages, inventory patterns, or seasonal buying habits without drowning in spreadsheets. Claire saw the problem with a clarity that made her restless. Big chains had expensive software teams. Small shops had notebooks, memory, and prayer, because apparently civilization had reached the moon, but could not help a florist remember who bought lilies every Mother's Day. Scalable name. He said Lumaloop sounded too soft. He suggested Nexera. Claire trusted him because he was her husband, and trust is beautiful until it becomes the door someone uses to rob you politely. Within 3 months, Ethan had filed the business registration under his name, rewritten the pitch deck with Claire's charts, and scheduled meetings she was somehow never invited to attend. When she questioned him, he told her she was not ready for rooms like that. Not yet. Maybe later, once the company had real traction. By the time Claire realized later would never come, Nexera Systems had seed funding. Ethan had a new office in Manhattan, and her name had disappeared from the story as cleanly as if it had never been there. By the time Ethan filed the papers for Nexera Systems, Claire had already begun to feel the walls of her own marriage moving closer. It was not one dramatic moment, not one door slammed, or one cruel sentence that explained everything. It was smaller than that, which somehow made it worse. Her calendar invitations disappeared. Her questions were answered with patient smiles that made her feel foolish for asking them. Ethan started saying, "my team," instead of "our project." He stayed late at the new office on West 27th Street, came home smelling faintly of hotel coffee and expensive cologne, and spoke about investor meetings as if they were weather systems too complex for her to understand. When Claire asked why her name was not on the latest pitch deck, he sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, "Claire, investors need one clear founder." Too many voices confused the story. It sounded reasonable if you were tired enough, and Claire was always tired. She was still working her operations job, still paying half the mortgage on their modest Queens home, still answering customer research emails at midnight, because she believed the product mattered more than her pride. That was the cruel genius of Ethan Bennett. He never told her she had no value. He simply taught her to accept less of it, one polite explanation at a time. Then Vanessa Cole appeared. At first, she was only a communications consultant, 29, sharp, glossy, and fluent in the language of branding that made empty rooms sound visionary. She began joining Ethan on calls, then at dinners, then in photographs beside him at startup panels where Claire was never mentioned. In one online article, Vanessa called Nexera Ethan's deeply personal mission to empower small businesses. Claire stared at those words in her apartment after the separation, her laptop glowing in the dark, and laughed once because the alternative was to fall apart. Deeply personal. Empower. Mission. Human beings could steal your umbrella in a thunderstorm and still describe themselves as champions of shelter. The divorce came 6 months after Nexera closed its first major funding round. Ethan said the marriage had become emotionally misaligned, a phrase so sterile Claire wondered whether he had workshopped it with legal counsel. His attorneys were polite, clean-shaven, and brutally efficient. They framed her involvement as informal support, the kind any spouse might offer over dinner. No signed founder agreement, no equity paperwork, no employment contract, just memories, notes, and a story no one powerful had any interest in hearing. Claire's own lawyer advised caution. Litigation would be expensive. Ethan had the company, the investors, and the public narrative. Claire had a laptop full of drafts she had been too heartbroken to organize and an inbox she could barely open without shaking. So she settled. She took a small amount of money, enough to move into a one-bedroom apartment in Sunnyside, and begin consulting for small retailers who still believed a person's word should mean something, which was charming in the same way antique furniture is charming, beautiful, useful, and constantly threatened by people with cheaper taste. For 2 years, Claire rebuilt herself quietly. She helped a neighborhood bakery increase repeat customers by 18%. She redesigned the inventory process for a family-owned clothing store in Connecticut. She trained herself not to flinch when Nexera appeared in business headlines. Each success was small, private, and honest. Still, every time Ethan stood on a stage and told the origin story of Nexera, Claire felt something inside her fold inward. Not because she wanted him back. That particular illusion had died without ceremony. What haunted her was simpler and harder to explain. He had not just taken her idea. He had taken the proof that she had once been brave enough to build it. The night of the Hudson Innovation Forum should have ended with Ethan smiling for photographs beneath a wall of sponsor logos. But Margaret Hayes had a talent for making powerful people uncomfortable with nothing more than a quiet request. While Ethan stepped off stage and accepted congratulations from men who smelled of bourbon, leather briefcases, and self-importance, Margaret's assistant, a young analyst named Priya Nair, slipped out of the ballroom with her phone pressed to her ear. Hayes Capital kept archives the way some families kept china, carefully labeled, slightly excessive, and brought out only when someone important needed to be reminded that memory could be weaponized. Within 20 minutes, Priya was in a side corridor outside the ballroom, balancing a tablet against one palm as old server files loaded from a secure cloud folder. The carpet under her heels was so thick it swallowed every sound, as if the hotel itself had been paid to keep secrets. Inside the ballroom, Claire remained at her table, her water glass untouched, her pulse still trying to outrun her dignity. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected Ethan to look through her as though she were a minor inconvenience from a previous tax year. What she had not expected was the strange expression on Margaret Hayes' face after Ethan's joke, that narrow-eyed stillness of someone recognizing a pattern beneath polished lies. Claire told herself not to hope. Hope, in her experience, was a beautiful little trap with good lighting. Ethan crossed the room toward her shortly before dessert was served, Vanessa moving beside him in a satin green dress and a smile sharp enough to cut ribbon at a corporate opening. "Claire," Ethan said, his voice warm for the benefit of anyone watching. "I am glad you came. I hope you did not take that comment personally. You know how these events are. A little humor keeps the room awake." Claire looked up at him. 5 years ago, she would have apologized for making the moment uncomfortable. 3 years ago, she would have rehearsed a perfect answer and then hated herself for forgetting it. Tonight, she simply said, "I heard exactly what you meant." Vanessa gave a soft laugh. Still sensitive, then. The words were small, almost elegant in their cruelty, dressed up as concern, The way rich people put terrible furniture in neutral colors and call it taste. Ethan's jaw tightened, not because Vanessa had insulted Claire, but because she had done it without permission. Control had always mattered more to him than kindness. Before he could answer, Margaret approached. She did not hurry. She had the kind of money that never needed to. Her silver hair was swept back, her black suit tailored with severe simplicity, and in her hand was a tablet with a blue glow reflecting faintly against her wedding ring. "Ethan," she said, pleasant enough to alarm him. A word. His face brightened automatically. "Margaret, always. I hope you enjoyed the presentation." "Parts of it were familiar," she said. For the first time that evening, Ethan did not know what expression to wear. Claire felt the air change around the table. Vanessa's smile remained in place, but her eyes flicked to the tablet. Margaret turned to Claire. "Mrs. Bennett, do you remember submitting a business plan to Hayes Capital in April of 2019? Claire's breath caught so sharply it felt like the room had tilted. The question traveled through her body before it became language. April of 2019. The third draft. The subject line. The attachment she had renamed at 2 in the morning because she worried the first version sounded unprofessional. "Yes," Claire said, her voice low. "I remember." Ethan laughed once, too quickly. "Margaret, I am sure there were many people thinking about small business software back then." "Certainly," Margaret replied. "But not many sent me a 42-page proposal called Luma Loop with the same customer retention model Nexera used in its first investor deck." The words landed softly, which made them worse. Around them, the ballroom continued to sparkle, forks touched porcelain. Investors murmured over coffee, and Ethan Bennett's empire began to make its first quiet, unmistakable cracking sound. For several seconds, nobody at the table moved. Ethan's smile did not vanish all at once. It faded in stages, like a storefront sign losing power one letter at a time. Claire could almost see his mind working behind his eyes, searching for the fastest route back to control. Denial first. Charm second. Legal language if charm failed. He had built an entire career on making other people doubt the evidence of their own senses, and now the evidence was glowing in Margaret Hayes's hand with a file name, a date, and Claire's name attached to it. "Margaret," Ethan said carefully, lowering his voice as if the problem were volume and not truth. "I think there is a misunderstanding. Early market research can resemble later innovation. That does not mean ownership." "No," Margaret said, "but timestamps do help." Claire's hands were still folded in her lap, but beneath the table her fingers had gone cold. It was strange what the body remembered. The smell of burned coffee from that April night. The hum of the refrigerator in the old Queen's kitchen. The ache in her right wrist from typing too long. The nervous little prayer she had whispered before pressing send, hoping one serious person in one serious office might see what she saw. For years, that email had lived in her memory like a ghost, real to her, but invisible to everyone else. Now it had returned wearing a subject line. Priya arrived beside Margaret with the tablet and a printed packet, because apparently even in the digital age, human beings needed paper before they believed a woman. Margaret opened the first page and placed it on the table between Claire and Ethan. At the top, in clean black type, were the words Claire had written 5 years earlier. Luma Loop Business Model, Draft 3, submitted by Claire Bennett. Beneath it were sections Claire could have recited in her sleep. Independent retailer retention gap. Automated loyalty timing. Seasonal purchase prediction. Customer follow-up mapping. Ethan stared at the page with the offended expression of a man who had found his own fingerprints on. A locked door. Vanessa leaned in, then leaned back, her lips pressed together. The emerald gleam of her dress suddenly looked less like confidence and more like costume jewelry under fluorescent light. "Anyone can write a proposal," Ethan said. "Execution is what matters." Claire looked at him then. Really looked. Not at the founder on magazine covers. Not at the husband who used to correct her in front of dinner guests with a smile. Not at the man who had told judges and attorneys and investors that she was supportive but confused. Just Ethan, a frightened man in a beautiful suit, standing beside the thing he had taken and calling theft execution. Margaret turned another page. "This proposal includes the original customer scoring model Nexera used in its seed deck. The terminology is nearly identical." Ethan's eyes flashed. "Nearly identical is not identical." "Then perhaps this is clearer," Margaret said. Priya tapped the screen. A second document appeared, An archived email response from Ethan's old account to Claire's. Margaret read it without raising her voice. "This is good, Claire. Let me clean it up and pitch it properly." The sentence settled over the table with surgical quiet. No one laughed this time. No one shifted comfortably in their chair. Nearby, a server carrying coffee paused, sensed the kind of silence that rich people usually paid consultants to avoid, and wisely disappeared toward the kitchen. Claire felt the years inside her rearrange themselves. Not disappear, nothing so convenient, but rearrange, as if the pain had finally found a shelf sturdy enough to hold it. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then looked toward Vanessa as if she might rescue him with a statement polished enough to turn fraud into branding. Vanessa did not speak. Her eyes were fixed on the packet, and for the first time Claire saw calculation turning against the man who had once benefited from it. Margaret slid the printed email toward Claire. "I think the board needs to review this before tomorrow's acquisition meeting." Ethan's head snapped up. "That meeting is confidential." "So was her work," Margaret replied. Claire touched the edge of the paper. Her name was there, not whispered, not remembered privately, printed, dated, preserved. She had imagined this moment so many times, usually with some grand speech, some perfect line that would make Ethan understand what he had done. But sitting there under crystal lights, with the city glittering 30 floors below and the truth finally breathing in the open, Claire realized she did not need to convince him of anything. The room had begun to understand without his permission. Margaret did not raise her voice, and somehow that made Ethan look smaller than shouting ever could have. "The board will review this tonight," she said, gathering the papers with the calm precision of a surgeon closing a case. "The acquisition committee meets at 8 tomorrow morning. Until then, I strongly recommend you do not make any public statements you cannot defend under oath." Ethan's face hardened at the last two words. Under oath. The phrase stripped the glamour from the room. Suddenly, the crystal chandeliers, the champagne flutes, the velvet chairs, and the step-and-repeat wall with Nextra's logo looked less like signs of victory and more like decorations at a very expensive misunderstanding. Claire stood because remaining seated felt impossible. Her knees were steady, which surprised her. For years, she had imagined that truth would arrive like thunder, loud enough to shake the windows and force everyone to look. Instead, it arrived like a calendar invite, a forwarded email, a woman with silver hair asking one careful question at the correct table. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Claire, do not let this become something ugly." There it was. The old spell. Not an apology. Not an explanation. A warning dressed as concern. Claire could hear the echo of every version he had used before. Do not overreact. Do not embarrass yourself. Do not make people uncomfortable. Do not ask for too much. She looked at him and realized the spell no longer had a home inside her. "You made it ugly when you took my work," she said. "I am only letting it become visible." Vanessa looked between them, her confidence thinning by the second. "Ethan," she said quietly, "is there something I should know?" The question was almost funny in its timing. Vanessa had built campaigns around his genius, coached him for interviews, polished his origin story until it shone like chrome. Now she was discovering what anyone who markets a myth eventually learns. The warranty expires when facts arrive. Ethan ignored her, which answered more than he meant to. Claire turned away from him and followed Margaret toward a private conference room off the ballroom. Priya walked beside them, tablet held against her chest, already sending secure messages to Hayes Capital's legal team. Behind them, the dinner continued with the brittle politeness of people pretending not to witness a collapse because dessert had not yet been served. And apparently manners are what humans invented when courage felt inconvenient. Midnight, Claire was no longer at the hotel. She was back in her one-bedroom apartment in Sunnyside, standing barefoot in front of her narrow kitchen counter while the city murmured beyond the window, and her phone lit up every few minutes with messages she could not bring herself to answer. The apartment was small, barely 600 square feet, with old hardwood floors that creaked in winter and a radiator that hissed like it had personal grievances. Yet it was the first place she had ever lived where no one corrected the way she folded towels, questioned her spending, or turned her dreams into evidence of her limitations. On the counter sat the printed packet Margaret had given her, sealed inside a cream folder with Hayes Capital's letterhead. Claire had carried it home in both hands like something fragile, though paper was not fragile. People were. Reputation was. Memory was, when powerful men had enough money to edit it. She made tea because her grandmother had always said tea helped when the world behaved badly, which was a charming theory and wildly optimistic, but Claire made it anyway. The steam curled into the dim kitchen light as she opened the folder again. Lumaloop Business Model, Draft 3, submitted by Claire Bennett. Her own name looked strange after years of being absent from rooms where it belonged. She touched the corner of the first page and remembered the woman who had written it. Younger, thinner from stress, still wearing her wedding ring, still believing that if she explained herself clearly enough, love would become fair. That woman had not been foolish. Claire understood that now. She had been trusting. There was a difference, and the world was lazy about noticing it. At 7:45 the next morning, Claire arrived at Nextra Systems headquarters on West 27th Street wearing the same navy dress, freshly pressed, and the cream blazer she had hung over a chair for exactly 3 hours before giving up on sleep. The building lobby was all glass, marble, and quiet intimidation, the kind of place designed to make visitors feel they needed permission to breathe. A receptionist looked up, recognized her name from the visitor list, and handed her a badge with unusual care. Not pity, not warmth. Awareness. Claire clipped it to her blazer and stepped into the elevator beside Margaret, Priya, and Daniel Price, the attorney Margaret had recommended before dawn. Daniel was in his early 40s, calm, precise, with the unhurried speech of someone who billed by the hour and knew fear was not admissible evidence. "You do not have to prove your worth in that room," he told Claire as the elevator climbed. "The documents will do that." Claire watched the floor numbers rise. "I spent years thinking I would need the perfect words." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "Perfect records are better." The boardroom occupied the 34th floor, with a view of Manhattan so wide it seemed almost arrogant. Ethan was already there when they entered. He stood near the windows in a charcoal suit, speaking quietly with 2 board members, his posture controlled but his face pale under the morning light. Vanessa sat at the far end of the table, no longer glowing, no longer leaning against him like part of the company brand. Her tablet was open, her expression unreadable. Around the table were investors, legal counsel, senior executives, and 3 independent directors who looked as if they had aged 5 years since dessert. Margaret took her seat without ceremony. Claire sat across from Ethan. For a moment, their eyes met over the long, polished table where so many decisions had been made without her. Ethan's expression softened into something almost familiar. "Claire," he said, quietly enough to sound wounded. "We could have handled this privately." Claire looked at the screen mounted on the wall as Priya connected her laptop. The first email appeared, bright and undeniable. "You had 5 years to handle it privately," Claire said. "You used them to call it yours." Priya dimmed the boardroom lights, and the first email filled the wall screen with the cold brightness of something that had waited 5 years to be believed. Claire Bennett, April 18th, 2019, 2:13 in the morning. Subject, Lumaloop Business Model, Draft 3. Attachment, Lumaloop_attention_model_Claire Bennett.pdf. No one spoke. The silence was not empty. It was crowded with calculation, embarrassment, liability, and the slow realization that every person in that room had repeated Ethan's origin story without ever asking who had been erased to make it sound clean. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Daniel Price opened a leather folder and slid copies of the evidence to the independent directors. "For the record," he said, "these documents include the original proposal, the first investor response, Mr. Bennett's reply offering to revise and pitch the concept, and a later Nextra seed deck, using substantially similar structure, terminology, and customer scoring logic." One of the directors, a gray-haired woman named Linda Carver, put on her reading glasses and leaned over the packet. She had been a former chief operating officer at a national retail chain, someone Claire had once admired from magazine interviews clipped and saved in a folder she never showed anyone. Linda turned one page, then another, and her mouth tightened. "This is not a vague resemblance," she said. Ethan sat back as if distance from the table could create distance from the truth. "Linda, with respect, every startup evolves from shared conversations. Claire and I were married. We discussed ideas constantly." Claire felt that familiar old pressure behind her ribs, the urge to defend every hour, every note, Every unpaid interview. Every night she had stayed awake while Ethan slept. But Daniel had been right. She did not need perfect words. The records had them. Priya clicked again. A slide from Claire's original proposal appeared beside an early Nexera investor slide. The layout had changed. The colors were different. The bones were the same. Customer return probability. Reminder timing by purchase cycle. Small retailer dashboard. Even one phrase, turning neighborhood memory into measurable loyalty, sat on both pages like a fingerprint Ethan had forgotten to wipe away. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Her face had gone pale beneath the careful makeup. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but clear enough for the room to hear. "Did you know this language came from her proposal?" Ethan shot her a look so sharp it revealed more than anger. It revealed panic. "This is not the time." "It seems exactly like the time," Linda Carver said. A younger board member coughed into his fist, badly pretending it was not satisfaction. Human beings, Claire thought, were remarkably committed to pretending a sinking ship was still a yacht until the water touched their shoes. Margaret turned to Ethan. Did Claire Bennett contribute foundational intellectual material to Nexera Systems before incorporation? Ethan's attorney, a compact man with silver cuff links and a face trained by years of expensive discomfort, raised a hand. "We should be careful with wording." "Then choose careful words," Margaret said. Ethan looked at Claire then, not with remorse, not yet, but with resentment, as if her evidence were an act of betrayal against his theft. "Claire had ideas," he said slowly. "I built a company." The sentence landed exactly where he intended it to land, in that old space where women's labor became inspiration and men's ambition became ownership. But this time the room did not bend around him. Linda closed the packet. "No, Ethan. You commercialized a framework she created and failed to disclose her role to this board, to investors, and possibly to acquirers." The word acquirers changed everything. The acquisition due diligence team from Northbridge Capital was scheduled to arrive in less than an hour. Their preliminary offer valued Nexera at $280 million, a number that had been floating through the company like perfume. Now it smelled like risk. Margaret nodded to Priya. "Contact Northbridge. The meeting is postponed pending internal review." Ethan stood so fast his chair rolled back across the carpet. "You cannot do that." Margaret looked up at him with the tired patience of a woman who had heard louder men be wrong in better suits. "I just did." The postponed acquisition meeting moved through Nexera's headquarters like a weather alert no one wanted to name. By 9:15, phones were vibrating under conference tables, assistants were whispering near glass doors, and senior managers who had arrived expecting celebration began refreshing business news with the anxious devotion of people waiting for bad medical results. Claire remained in the boardroom while Daniel reviewed the timeline with Nexera's legal counsel. She had imagined this building many times over the years, usually from the outside, usually with a bitterness she was embarrassed to admit. She had pictured polished floors, clever slogans on walls, young employees drinking cold brew under the soft tyranny of open office design. She had not imagined sitting inside it while strangers quietly discovered that the foundation beneath their company had someone else's handwriting on it. Ethan stood near the far window, speaking in a low voice with his attorney. The skyline behind him was bright and indifferent. Morning sun struck the glass towers of Manhattan, making the whole city look expensive and innocent, which was a lie cities tell better than people. Vanessa had left the room 10 minutes earlier after receiving a text that made her face change. Claire had not followed her, but through the glass wall she saw Vanessa in the hallway, one hand pressed to her temple, speaking rapidly into her phone. There was no tenderness in her posture now, no loyal fiancé standing beside a misunderstood visionary. There was only brand management in heels. Margaret called the meeting back to order at 9:30. "We need to address immediate governance risk," she said. "The acquisition cannot proceed while founder attribution, disclosure, and intellectual property issues remain unresolved." Ethan turned from the window. "You are making this sound criminal." Daniel looked up from his notes. "No one used that word. You implied it." "The documents implied it," Daniel said. "I simply brought copies." Linda Carver's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Claire looked down quickly to hide the unexpected flicker of satisfaction, because apparently dignity did not prevent a person from enjoying a well-placed sentence. Truth into a process. Process into fatigue. fatigue into silence. It was the same machine Ethan had used during the divorce, only now it wore a corporate badge. Margaret did not let it settle. There will be an investigation, she said, but it will be independent. Outside counsel. Full document preservation. No deletion of internal communications. No employee coaching. No revised origin statements. The board will appoint a temporary operating committee effective today. Ethan's face went still. Temporary operating committee? Linda folded her hands. You will step aside from acquisition negotiations pending review. The sentence was so calm it took a second to reveal its teeth. Ethan stared at her. You are removing me from my own company. Margaret's expression did not change. We are protecting the company from a problem you created. For the first time, Claire saw something raw break through Ethan's polished surface. Not remorse. Not grief. Exposure. He looked around the table as if searching for the room that had always rearranged itself around him. But that room no longer existed. Board members avoided his eyes. Legal counsel wrote notes. Priya saved files to a secure drive. The machinery of power had not become kinder overnight. It had simply changed direction, and Ethan, who had once operated it so gracefully, was now standing in its path looking offended by gravity. Then the conference room door opened. Vanessa stepped in, her coat over one arm, her engagement ring still catching the light like a tiny public relations problem. I have resigned from all communications duties, she said, not to Ethan, but to Margaret. My attorney will contact the company regarding any statements issued under my department. Ethan turned toward her. Vanessa. She did not move closer. You told me Claire exaggerated everything. The room went quiet again, but this silence was different. Smaller. Personal. Vanessa looked at Claire, and for one brief second, the arrogance was gone. What remained was not apology, not exactly, but recognition. Then she left. Ethan watched the door close, and Claire felt no triumph. Only a weary understanding that lies did not destroy one. Life at a time. They spread, elegant and efficient, until everyone near them had to decide whether to keep decorating the damage. Margaret slid a document across the table to Claire. Means it is probably free. Claire took it, grateful for something ordinary. What happens to him? Daniel glanced through the glass at Ethan, who was now seated alone at the far end of the boardroom, while his attorney spoke with two directors. Without Vanessa beside him, without the room laughing when he expected it to, he looked less like a founder and more like a man waiting for a bill he had hoped would never arrive. The board will suspend his authority during the investigation, Daniel said. Northbridge will either pause or renegotiate. If the records hold, there may be settlement discussions, amended founder disclosures, equity remedies, possibly public correction. It depends on how much truth the company can afford. Claire looked at him. That is a depressing sentence. Most legal sentences are. Margaret stepped into the hallway a moment later, her phone in one hand and reading glasses in the other. Northbridge has agreed to postpone for 30 days, she said. They want transparency before proceeding. The board is preparing a statement for internal staff only. No press yet. And me? Claire asked. Margaret's gaze softened, though her voice remained practical. You will be asked to meet with outside counsel this afternoon. After that, I intend to recommend that Nexera formally recognize your foundational contribution and bring you into the restructuring process as a strategic advisor. If you want that role. Claire turned back toward the office. Through the glass, she saw a young employee at a desk decorated with a photo of a golden retriever, a half-finished protein bar, and a tiny ceramic cactus. Ordinary life inside a complicated lie. She thought of the bakery owner in Brooklyn who had cried when repeat orders finally stabilized her cash flow. She thought of the hardware store in Jersey City, the florist in Queens, the boutique manager who had sent her a handwritten thank you card. The idea had never been about Ethan. Company, Claire said. Margaret nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer but respected her more for saying it. Then help make it honest. Behind them, the boardroom door opened. Ethan stepped out, his face pale, his tie loosened for the first time Claire could remember seeing it that way. He looked at Margaret, then Daniel, then finally Claire. Can we talk? He asked. Once, that question would have pulled her backward through years of habit. Today, Claire simply held the terrible office coffee between both hands and said, only with my attorney present. Ethan blinked, and in that tiny pause, Claire felt something inside her stand up straight. The small conference room they used for the conversation had no view, which felt appropriate. It was a narrow internal room with frosted glass walls, a round table, 6 chairs, and a speakerphone in the center that looked as if it had listened to too many bad decisions and given up on humanity. Daniel sat beside Claire with his legal pad open. Ethan sat across from them, his attorney to his right, both men arranged in the stiff posture of people trying to make discomfort look strategic. For a moment, no one spoke. The building hummed around them with the mechanical calm of corporate life continuing because payroll, unlike morality, had deadlines. Ethan looked at Claire as if waiting for the version of her who used to fill silences to appear. She did not. The first time that morning, something like shame crossed his face. It was brief, almost shy, and Claire distrusted it immediately. Shame had visited Ethan before. It never unpacked. "I was under pressure," he said. The first investors wanted certainty. They wanted a founder who could scale, someone technical, someone aggressive. "I thought if I brought you in too early, they would dismiss the whole thing." Claire listened to the words, each one polished smooth by self-protection. Fear. Ethan swallowed. His attorney shifted, uncomfortable now for reasons that had nothing to do with liability. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. Claire looked at Daniel, then back at him. For years, she had thought the answer would be revenge. She had pictured taking everything from him, watching his name shrink in the same rooms where hers had vanished. But now that the room was real, revenge felt strangely small, like buying an expensive coat in the wrong size because pain had convinced you it would fit. "I want formal recognition," she said. "I want the company record corrected. I want equity appropriate to a foundational founder contribution. I want every investor and board document amended. I want my work attributed to me. And I want no private story told later that makes this sound like generosity from you." Ethan stared at her. "That could cost me control." Claire stood slowly, and Daniel gathered his papers beside her. "You lost control when the truth became easier to prove than your version of it." The formal recognition did not arrive in a burst of music or a dramatic headline, because real justice, when it finally gets around to doing its job, often looks like paperwork sent through secure email. 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, Nexera Systems issued an amended founder history to its investors, its employees, and Northbridge Capital. The language had been reviewed so many times by attorneys that it could barely breathe, but Claire read every line anyway. Claire Bennett was acknowledged as the original creator of the customer retention framework, the author of the first LumaLoop business model, and a foundational contributor to what later became Nexera Systems. Foundational contributor. Original creator. Author. The words were careful, but they were hers. Ethan resigned from his role as chief executive officer the same morning the statement went out. The announcement called it a transition in leadership because corporate America could discover a volcano under the conference table and still describe the lava as strategic repositioning. He retained a reduced ownership stake pending settlement terms, lost voting control, and was barred from representing the company in acquisition talks. There were no handcuffs, no public spectacle, no satisfying collapse staged for the internet. Just consequences, clean and cold, which in some ways was worse for a man who had always mistaken applause for innocence. Vanessa disappeared from Nexera's website within 24 hours. Her biography, once glowing with phrases like visionary communications leader and brand architect, vanished into whatever digital basement companies used to hide yesterday's confidence. Claire did not celebrate that. She had learned enough about humiliation to know it spread too easily when people cheered for it. What she wanted was not a bonfire. She wanted a nameplate. A month later, she stood inside a newly emptied office on the 34th floor, looking at one. Claire Bennett, co-founder and chief strategy officer. The letters were etched in brushed steel, modest and permanent, fixed beside a glass door that looked out over Manhattan. Margaret stood beside her, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the same terrible office machine Daniel had insulted weeks earlier. "It still tastes like printer ink," Margaret said, handing one over. Claire smiled. "Then at least something here is consistent." The restructuring had not been simple. Nothing involving lawyers, investors, bruised egos, and millions of dollars ever was. Northbridge had returned to the table, but only after Nexera agreed to independent governance controls, corrected intellectual property disclosures, and a revised leadership team. Claire had negotiated equity, back compensation, and formal attribution with Daniel beside her in every meeting. She had not gotten everything. Nobody ever does, not even in stories people tell to survive their own disappointment. But she had gotten enough to make the record honest. More importantly, she had gotten enough to stop feeling like proof was something she had to carry alone. On her first full day, Claire asked to meet with the product team, not the press. She walked into a room full of nervous engineers, designers, analysts, and customer success managers who had no idea whether to applaud, apologize, or update their LinkedIn profiles. She did not make them suffer long. "I am not here to punish the people who build honestly," she told them. "I am here to make sure the company finally does." Then she opened a slide deck titled LumaLoop Principles, and for the first time in 5 years, she explained the idea in her own voice. She talked about the bakery in Brooklyn, the florist in Queens, the hardware store in Jersey City, the way small business owners remembered birthdays, favorite colors, allergies, anniversaries, and grief, all without a software budget or a marketing department. She told them Nexera had never been meant to replace that human memory. It had been meant to protect it. By the time she finished, the room was silent in the best possible way. Not stunned. Listening. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Claire stood alone by the window with the city spread beneath her in glittering miles. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Ethan. No apology, not really. Just 7 words. "I did not know how to fix it." Claire looked at the screen for a long moment, then turned the phone face down on the desk. Some things could not be fixed by the person who broke them. Some things had to be rebuilt by the person who survived. She looked again at the nameplate on the door, at the skyline beyond it, at the reflection of a woman who had once mistaken being erased for being gone. She had not destroyed Ethan's company. She had not taken back her marriage. She had done something harder, quieter, and far more lasting. She had taken back the truth, placed her name where it belonged, and walked into the future without asking anyone's permission to be remembered. The public correction came later, not because Claire demanded spectacle, but because truth that affects investors, employees, and customers cannot remain tucked neatly inside a legal folder like an embarrassing family photo. Nexera released a revised company statement on a Tuesday morning, the least dramatic day of the week, which felt painfully appropriate. The statement acknowledged Claire Bennett's original authorship of the LumaLoop framework and her role as co-founder in the technology and strategy that became Nexera's core product. It did not use Ethan's name more than necessary. Attorneys had apparently decided that even grammar could become a lawsuit if left unsupervised. By noon, business reporters were calling. By 2, the startup newsletters had discovered the story and begun carving it into headlines. By evening, Claire's inbox was full of interview requests, congratulations from people who had once gone silent, and 3 messages from former acquaintances who opened with, "I always knew," which was a fascinating phrase, considering they had done absolutely nothing with that knowledge when it might have cost them something. Claire answered almost none of them. She spent the afternoon in a product review meeting with the customer success team, rewriting onboarding language for independent retailers who did not care about founder drama and simply wanted software that did not require a graduate degree to operate. That, more than any headline, steadied her. Work had always been the place where her mind became quiet. Honest work, especially. 2 weeks later, she visited the Brooklyn bakery that had once been one of her first consulting clients. It was a narrow place on a tree-lined street, warm with the smell of cinnamon, butter, and coffee strong enough to make accountants confess emotions. The owner, Ruth Feldman, was behind the counter tying a white apron around her waist when Claire walked in, gently over which pastry to bring their grandson. This was the world Claire had built LumaLoop for. Not pitch stages, not magazine spreads, not men who confused ownership with being the loudest person near an idea. Small businesses were not romantic because they were easy. They were romantic because people kept choosing them even when spreadsheets suggested surrender. When Claire returned to Nexera that afternoon, the office felt different. Not perfect. No building became ethical because someone changed a plaque. But different. The product team had started calling the original framework by its proper name in internal documents. LumaLoop Principles. Claire's name appeared in the company history page. New disclosure training was scheduled for managers. Margaret had pushed through an ethics review process that made several executives look as if they had swallowed office supplies, which Claire considered a promising sign. Near sunset, Linda Carver stopped by Claire's office with a thin folder. "The board approved the final settlement structure," she said. equity adjustment, back compensation, public attribution, and continuing strategic authority. Daniel will walk you through the details. Claire took the folder, but she did not open it right away. Money mattered. Equity mattered. Control mattered. She was not going to pretend otherwise for the comfort of people who preferred women noble and underpaid. But at that moment, what caught her attention was the reflection in the office glass. Her own face, older than the woman who had written the first proposal at 2 in the morning, calmer than the wife who had begged to be included, stronger than the person who had once believed silence was the price of survival. On her desk sat the original printed proposal, now framed in simple black wood. Not hidden in an inbox. Not buried under someone else's logo. Visible. Claire placed the settlement folder beside it and turned on the small brass desk lamp Ruth had given her as a gift. The light warmed the room, touched the steel letters on her door, and settled over her name as if it had always been waiting there.